Good evening, everybody. We're just going to give it another minute or so for people to join us, and then we'll get started. Good evening, everyone. You're all very welcome to this One Movement webinar event. My name is Angela Flynn. I'm the president of IFUT, the Irish Federation of University Teachers, and I hope you can all hear me. If anyone has any problems, you might indicate now if there's any problems with my sound, but I'm hoping you can all hear me okay. Okay, so I'm your moderator for this evening, and I'm delighted to be able to host and moderate this really exciting webinar. Got some great speakers. So just a little bit about the One Movement. The One Movement is a network of trade unions at county level, working in a collaborative and cooperative way within workplaces and communities. It includes the One Cork and the One Galway movements, along with 15 active trades councils. This is the second in our One Future, One Vision webinar series. And our topic for tonight is Funding a New Future for All. And it features Michael Taft, economist with SIPTU, and Tom McDonnell, co-director of NERI, who will discuss a number of economic issues. And we're very lucky to have this level of expertise in the virtual room with us this evening. Before we kick off, I just want to give you a little detail about this series. Each month, the Trades Council from across the country will host a session for approximately an hour to discuss issues of importance to workers. In the new year, we'll be moving on to issues such as health and safety, implications of COVID-19, the need for greater investment in public services. We'll be talking about a just transition, and we'll be looking at union recognition and collective bargaining. So keep in touch with your union, who will inform you of the dates and times of these events as they're coming up. Now, tonight, I'm delighted to introduce you to our fantastic panel of two, and I'd like to welcome Michael Taft. Many of you will be familiar with Michael's work. Michael is a researcher with SIPTU and author of the political economy blog Notes on the Front, where he provides very astute commentary and analysis on Irish political economy, international issues, and economic trade union matters. Also with us tonight is Tom McDonnell. Tom is co-director of the Nevin Economic Research Institute. He has co-responsibility for the NERI's research program and for its strategic direction. He's also responsible for, among other things, NERI's analysis of the Republic of Ireland's economy, including risks, trends, and forecasts. He specialises in economic growth, economics of innovation, Irish and European economies, and fiscal policy. He has previously worked as an economist at Task and has lectured in economics at NUI Galway, at GCU, and at Maynooth University. Michael and Tom, you're both very welcome. So some minor housekeeping issues before we get cracking. I know that everyone's probably suffering from a bit of online fatigue, so we don't intend to hold you here longer than an hour. However, we do want to hear from you. So as the speakers are making their contributions, we can take some questions from you all. You can post your questions to us using the chat function or the Q&A function on the side. You'll see it down towards the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and you'll be able to add in here and your questions in text, type them in there, and we will be able to ask the question to your panelist. You are muted for this webinar, and your cameras are off as a default setting, so don't worry about any of that. So without further ado, I gather that Tom is going to go first. And Tom, I'd like you to make your contribution now. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Angela. So I'll go first and then lead on to Michael, who I know is going to talk about the medium and long term. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what it is we are really trying to achieve in terms of the economy. And obviously, one of the things that people talk about is economic growth, and that is important, that people have better access to goods and services, and that grows over time. But alongside that, economic growth needs to be inclusive. So that means everyone needs to benefit from it. That's not simply ensuring that everyone has a sufficient income, and of course, that's not even where we are at the moment. But it's crucial that budgetary policy, that economic policy is inclusive, and finally that it is sustainable. So sustainable, inclusive growth, those are generally the three principles or three guiding lights or triple bottom line that we attempt to achieve. Now, I suppose I'll focus on the short term. I'm going to talk briefly about what the government did in Budget 2021. And the first thing to say is that it was essentially a firefighting budget. So really what the government here was attempting to do was to preserve as much of the economy as possible so that we can get out onto the other side in 2022, or hopefully a little bit before 2022, with as much of the economy protected as possible. So that means things such as wage subsidy schemes to keep that link between employers and employees. It means business supports to ensure that businesses don't collapse. And it means contingent funds, which can be released or withdrawn as the economy goes up and down through the various stages of lockdown. Now, broadly speaking, the government did, in my view, a reasonably okay job. There are a lot of things that one could criticize. For example, in terms of income supports related to, say, the pandemic unemployment payments, I think they were caught out there. A number of their economic supports as well were poorly designed, frankly. The 9% VAT rate will simply benefit businesses that are actually doing okay because they're selling goods and services. And the Help to Buy scheme will just simply make houses more affordable for most people, and will do nothing to improve housing supply. So that's wasted money, essentially. Better strategies would be for the government to build houses themselves in relation to Help to Buy, and in relation to the 9% VAT. You're better off giving subsidies to firms directly to deal with fixed costs associated with things like insurance and rent and so forth. And then they made another mistake, in my view, in terms of what you want to do during a recession is you want fiscal policy to be expansionary. That's tax and spend. You want monetary policy to be expansionary. That means buying government bonds, keeping interest rates low, and so on. And you also want wage policy to be expansionary. So, in my view, they made a mistake by only increasing the minimum wage by 1%, by not increasing the value of social transfers, and so on and so forth. That will subdue demand ultimately. Now, the overall stance was broadly good. It was an expansionary budget. We all know that, although the figures around 18-20 billion are somewhat misleading, to say the least. They could have gone much further in terms of infrastructure, for example. They only increased the infrastructure budget by about 600 million over the white paper that pre-existed the budget. That's disappointing, because there's never a better time to invest than when interest rates are extremely low, as they are at the moment, and when, unfortunately, you're looking at a situation of a very high unemployment rate, likely to persist and worsen, as it's certainly possible, through 2021. And the research from groups which are certainly not left-wing groups, such as the IMF, is that the best thing one could do during a crisis like this is to invest in things like green electricity, efficient buildings, public transport, and so on. I know Michael will talk more about that, so I'm not going to get too far into it. But I will throw in two caveats. One is that infrastructure cannot be an immediate panacea, because there is a lag effect associated with the start of a new project. That doesn't apply to all projects. Maintenance, for example, can be continued. And then a certain issue relates to capacity constraints within the construction sector and the engineering sector broadly. That relates to labour supply, lack of workers, lack of skills, but also issues around funding as well. Another critique could be around the lack of a clear vision in the budget. There's no sense of where we're going here. There was no increase in spending on childcare provision, for example. Or at least very modest. And that means Ireland will continue and will persist as one of the most expensive countries in the entire OECD in terms of childcare. and that will simply push primarily second earners and lone parents out of the workforce. And it goes without saying that there's an enormous gender dimension to that. Similarly, we're going to come out of this budget with again the largest class sizes in Europe. Our education spend on a per pupil basis will remain pitifully low, particularly at higher level. Our public R&D spend is very low too. That will be a false economy in the long run. Less innovation, less new firms, less technologies, less diffusion of knowledge, and so forth. All of those things will be dampened by the failures of government policy now. We can modestly praise the modest green measures that were in the budget. I think we're hardly talking about a Green New Deal here. There were some measures around VRT, some measures around retrofitting. There's a concern that many of the measures around retrofitting, for example, will essentially just be subsidies for the middle classes. Yes, we want middle class firms to have more energy efficient houses, but we also want to ensure that all household types can benefit from these green measures. And it's important that nobody is left behind here, particularly in the context of the inevitable rise in things like the carbon tax over the years to come. It's important that we have a just transition here. Just transition applies to things such as workers in Bord na Móna and the Midlands, but it also applies to low-income households that could lose out as a result of these taxes. And while my own view is that I support these taxes, I do so in the context of no one being left behind and nobody losing out. There are a number of options here. I would look for radical proposals along the lines of expansion of universal basic services in the form of free public transport and expansion of public transport, for example. That's the kind of measures that we need to be focusing on. There's also the issue about the sustainability of the budget. And now you're looking at a deficit of around 20 to 21 billion in 2020. And that will decline in 2021 and then will continue to decline, as Michael will show, over subsequent years. I'm reasonably sanguine about a deficit of that size because it's mostly associated with once-off costs, well, or at least a lot of it is to do with once-off costs associated with the pandemic, which will not be there in 2022 onwards, one hopes. Also, if we can invest in infrastructure and these type of measures, plus the measures such as the wage subsidy scheme that keep employers and employees glued together, we'll have a stronger economy on the other side, and that will allow employment to return quicker, and that return of employment and return of incomes will deal with the deficit problem over the medium term, in my view. And I suppose associated with that and related to that is the fact that household savings have dramatically increased since the second quarter of 2020. So while the government deficit has increased, at the same time, household savings have increased. So we've seen government taking on debt, households taking on credit. Once the pandemic passes, once people are confident to go out into the shops again, as long as their jobs have been protected, I anticipate that we will see a massive increase in aggregate demand in the second half of 2021 and into 2022. That will give a boost to the economy. So by acting countercyclically now, by running large deficits, we keep the economy strong. It's an investment in the future and will allow us to thrive and be in a much stronger position as we move into the 2020s. So I think that's about 10 minutes, and I'll leave it there for now. Thanks very much.
Super. Thanks, Tom. You're well under time. Very interesting reflections there on maybe lost opportunities in budget 2021. Okay, so just a reminder to pop any comments you want into the chat or any questions for our panel. And of course, there is some reading that people could do if they're very interested around the SIPTU's policy on a progressive fiscal framework and ICTU's document, No Going Back, which we might be able to share with participants at some point. Okay, Michael, I'm going to come to you and I'll let you unmute, and thank you very much. So you have about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we can have a bit of discussion and bring Tom back in if that works. Thanks, Michael. You're still muted, Michael.
So, all right, there we go. Is that visible? Okay. I mean, Tom spoke about the high level of expenditure that we are incurring this year, and other high levels of expenditure next year. However, we should be aware, looking down the line, looking over a few years, over the medium term, we've already begun to hear voices talking about how bills will come due. We need to balance the books. Recently, the Minister for Finance warned that tough choices would have to be made to bring borrowing and spending under control. And tough choices don't necessarily equate to right choices. The program for government is called for a broadly balanced budget. Now, when SIPTU took a look at this in producing its progressive fiscal framework, what we found is that we do not need austerity to stabilize our public finances, even though it seems such a very high level now. Economic growth will bring stability. Economic growth to increase tax revenue and reduce unemployment costs. Even the government in the budget stated that growth will do the heavy lifting of repairing public finances. And the Irish Fiscal Council produced some helpful scenarios of how they see the deficit playing out. And if you see the chart there, it starts at about, the deficit's about 7%, over 7%, but it will be reduced to about 1.5% by 2025. In other words, 80% of the deficit will disappear simply because the economy is growing. That's without any type of measures, without spending cuts or tax increases. So we can see that the arguments, any arguments to bring about austerity or to soften up people for measures of austerity are completely misplaced in terms of how we bring our public finances under control. And that's why SIPTU proposes a fiscal policy over the next few years based on what's called the Golden Rule. There is no economic rationale for a balanced budget until we reach full economic and social capacity, and this includes full employment. If we force fiscal policy into a balanced budget straitjacket, we will undermine public investment or require austerity measures in public services and social protection. The Golden Rule can protect us from that, and it's very simple what the Golden Rule is. You bring day-to-day spending into balance. In other words, you balance your current tax revenue and your current budget, which is mostly, it's made up of public services and social protection. So you bring that into balance and you borrow for productive investment. In other words, you deficit finance that. So over the medium term, instead of targeting a balanced budget, we're proposing approximately a deficit of 2% of GDP to spread us out over the years. This would mean that we would be able to finance an investment program which will be so key to our ability to overcome a number of challenges that we will face. Because avoiding austerity is not enough. We have identified what we call a decade of challenges. I mean, even before the crisis, Ireland had a number of infrastructural deficits. I mean, there was public housing, health sector capacity, water and waste, telecommunications, modern childcare facilities, and on and on. We have these infrastructural deficits coming into the crisis. In addition, we'll be facing Brexit and the impact on our domestic exporting sector. And we should remember that even with a deal, the economy will still be negatively impacted by Brexit. Then there's the existential crisis of climate change and the need for a just transition. There's the onset of automation, AI, and robotics, which can be called the fourth industrial revolution. And the Fiscal Council projects that the beginning of an economic drought as we enter into the next decade. They're predicting 20 years of low growth and low productivity. Now, any one of these would have been a challenge to our economy and society. But if they all come together in the next 10 years, you can see the scale of the challenge that we face. We need a new economic and business model. So when we talk about driving investment, let us remember, investment is not a cost. It is a down payment today to generate revenue in the future by creating new assets that will drive productivity and efficiency over the next 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, if you look at it, businesses and households borrow to pay for investment. Very few people could actually buy a house out of their current income. However, once they pay off their borrowing, they have free accommodation and an asset in retirement. Same thing with businesses. They need to constantly invest in new machinery, technology, and market expansion. If investment was a cost, no business since the beginning of capitalism would ever invest. But the fact is they have to. This is how they continually modernize and improve their activity. So with interest rates so low, it makes fiscal sense to borrow under the golden rule, targeting that 2% deficit over the medium term. Just to give you an idea, it may seem like 2% may not seem like much, but it can be up to 8 billion euros by 2025. That's a significant amount of money that we would have to engage in investment in so many key sectors. And interest rates, listen, it's just absolutely off the wall. We are now, the investors are now buying our bonds. We are lending to investors who in turn are actually paying us an interest rate. It's like if you went to the bank and you bought a mortgage and then the bank paid you an annual interest rate rather than you paying them an annual interest rate. That's how crazy it has gotten. That is due, of course, to the far-sighted policies of the European Central Bank, who are doing everything to keep interest rates low. So essentially, it's free money, and that's why we should be borrowing now during this period of low interest rates, because it's not going to last, for the next 10 years, and it means that we can have over time we can pay it back. But the growth that it will induce will make it much easier to pay it back or refinance. And it means that we will have a more prosperous economy at the end of the day. So what we need to do, as Tom said, there's only so much you can do in any 1 year because of capacity constraints and all that. So we're suggesting that what we need to do is borrow as much as we can now and warehouse the debt for investment in the years to come. Bake in those low interest rates so that in 2026, 2027, we will still have this low interest money that we can use to invest in the economy. The third aspect is about expanding the tax base, because there is a critical part of the golden rule, and that is the money that you spend on public services and social protection, you have to balance with an elevated tax revenue base. Ireland is a low tax economy. We would need to spend over 10 billion euros just to reach average day-to-day spending of our EU peer group. That's spending on public services like health and education, or spending on social protection. Therefore, we need to strengthen and expand our tax base. Now, the problem is when anybody talks about a low tax economy, everybody says, "Oh my God, you're going to come after my taxes. You're going to increase taxes on myself and my family." Well, no, that's not true. We've got to get this message across. The fact is that Irish personal taxation, income tax, USC, PRSI, it happens to be average compared to our peer group in the EU, other high-income economies. Our low tax status can be explained by below average social insurance contributions from employers and below average taxes on capital. As you can see here in the graph, the graph on the left-hand side shows just how far behind we are in spending on public services. We would have to increase it by 8 billion to reach the average. But on the graph on the right, you can see employees' personal taxation It's about average, you know. So, by the way, is consumption taxes like VAT and excise. It's about average. Where we really fall down is employer social insurance and capital taxes. And what I mean by capital taxes, inheritance, capital gains, taxes on property and assets. So those are the two areas where we need over time to increase so that we can pay for enhanced public services and enhanced social protection while we are borrowing to fund public investment. You know, you wouldn't start increasing employer social insurance until the recovery is embedded, but then you do it incrementally. By the way, employer social insurance here would nearly have to double to reach the average in other EU countries. And out of that, you would get strong illness benefits, maternity benefits, and strong unemployment benefits. Secondly, increasing taxation on capital. That's something we can actually start to do now because taxation on capital, whether it's passive income like inheritance and gifts or unproductive capital and speculation, that doesn't have much of a negative impact on the economy. And thirdly, we need to increase taxation on environmentally damaging activities such as carbon emissions combined with income supports for low and average income groups. Let's not fall into the mistaken notion that somehow everybody's become a Keynesian just because, assuming that Keynesianism is somehow reduced to spending and deficits. Government is spending money now because it doesn't really have a choice. If it didn't act to shore up the productive economy, the cost would be far higher in the future in terms of enterprise destruction and higher unemployment. But unfortunately, there was nothing in this budget to suggest that it is anything other than an emergency response to a public health crisis. As Tom said, we don't see a story going forward. And therefore, the idea this is somehow going to create a paradigm shift for an expanding role of the state in the economy, well, that still remains to be seen. And finally, you know, we talk about, you know, public finances and investment and economic growth as something the Minister for Finance does on budget day. That's not true. Actually, what is fiscal? Our budgets, our public finances actually reflect the structure in the economy. And what we need to do is put the economy on a high road employment, high road working conditions, high road innovation, high road increase in private investment. And so what we need is a worker-centered recovery. There are two ways of doing that. In the first instance, we need to grow the wage share. Again, as you see on the graphic on the right-hand side, our wage share is well below that of the EU average among our peer group. The wage share merely means the total amount of wages as a proportion of the whole economy. If we were to start to increase that wage share, that would generate hundreds of millions of euros in tax revenue and economic activity. What is the best way to increase that wage share? Give workers the right to collective bargaining. Vindicate their right, especially those among the low-income sectors. Because where we really fall down in wages are wages in the hospitality and the retail sector. Our low-paid are ultra-low-paid compared to their counterparts on the continent. So let's give people the tools to improve their working conditions, and they will drive economic growth. And let's use their experience, their skills, and their knowledge to drive economic recovery. For instance, in the public services, this can be done through employee-driven innovation, where employees design improvements to increase efficiency in their workplace. It's employees who are the first ones to confront the problems in a public service or in an enterprise activity. They're the ones that have to come up with the kind of makeshift solutions just to get things over the line. They are the ones that can contribute to broader-based reforms, which will increase productivity and increase innovation. And finally, sectoral task forces. The government In its program for government, it's talked about establishing sectoral task force, which will look at particular sectors. They talked about new ways of engaging with stakeholders. This is actually positive. This is welcome if they go through with it, because we will need a real detailed focus on a number of sectors that will be hit with challenges. We think of hospitality, physical retail, transportation, finance, export sector. So we need a focus on those sectors with all those stakeholders, and that's why it's imperative that workers are fully represented on all sectoral task forces. This would be the first step towards broader workplace democracy and broader sectoral collective bargaining in the economy. So the summary is this: golden rule, borrow for productive investment. Take advantage of the low interest rates, get as much resources as you can, and warehouse that debt for investment that will see us over the decade. Expand the tax base once we hit recovery, especially focusing on employers' social insurance, and bring workers to the very heart of strategies for economic recovery, both with their ability to bargain collectively with their employers and their abilities to drive innovation and productivity in the workplace. Thank you, Angela.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Michael.
I'm just going to stop sharing here.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Thanks so much. That's really great, and we've had some great points made there from both of our speakers. So we have quite a few questions have already come in the chat. So unless, Tom, did you want to come back on anything, or did you guys want to exchange any views before we go to the questions?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to come back in there, Angela. Look, I agree with 99% of what Michael said there. That's probably no surprise. I think Michael identified a number of challenges there: Brexit, climate change, automation, productivity. But what I'd say is, these are all challenges, but we're not helpless against these challenges. And I suppose the most obvious one is productivity. We know how to generate higher levels of productivity going forward. One of the reasons why productivity has fallen back in the last 20 years is that almost every country in the West, or in the OECD generally, has cut back on infrastructure spending, has not kept pace in terms of education spending, has cut back on R&D spending. All of these things, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, lead to lower levels of productivity. And again, so some of the linkages between productivity or some of the things that lead to higher levels of productivity can be surprising. The evidence suggests that child poverty is the most deleterious and damaging thing one can do in terms of productivity. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the focus is on the tragedy and disaster of poverty for that individual child. All the economy loses long term, because unfortunately the reality is people rarely come back. So again, Michael's points about the revenue gap, I would completely agree with that. This budget wasn't the time to do that, but getting that discussion going is really important. There will be a new commission of social insurance, of taxation and social protection rather, being formed in the next month or two. It's important that the progressive voices input into that. That will be a major look, the first ever, perhaps for first ever significant look at Ireland's social insurance system and Ireland's social wage. We've seen the gaps in that system over the last year in terms of sick pay and indeed other areas. So this hopefully will be the beginning of a conversation or a real social dialogue about the need to improve employer peer aside, that major gap that we have with almost every other Western European country, allowing us to put in place some of the benefits that the workers in other countries take for granted. And then again, we talk about the economy. It's not just about productivity, it's also about labour force participation. And again, that brings back to the point about childcare and all these unnecessary barriers that we put that essentially force people out of the labour force. So I would very much welcome Michael's paper.
Super, thanks, Tom. Can I just go to the questions in the chat? The first question is asking, what is your view of introducing a job guarantee for young people in particular, and what would that look like? Any comments on a job guarantee? Who would like to take that? Michael?
Well,
Yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, no. I was going to say that actually this would be a particularly opportune time for a job guarantee, and there are a number of things that could be done. So, for example, there are many types of economic activity that simply cannot happen at the moment. I'm thinking of things like aviation, of course, accommodation, food services. All of these areas are constrained by government decree at the moment. Also, there's a danger that young people in particular will fall out of the labour market. If you graduate into a very weak jobs market, it tends to punish you throughout your subsequent career. And it can be quite damaging from a psychological point of view. So I think there's a very strong economic case for a job guarantee during a crisis as significant as this. What would people do is a very, very good question. Some suggestions I've heard, the best ones would probably involve outdoor work. In many cases, workers wouldn't necessarily have the skills to do construction and the like, but there are things such as tree planting and so on and so forth that would help us reach some of our other targets, and could tide people over and help people learn new skills. Equally important, though, is that we focus on retraining, apprenticeships and things like that, and transitioning people from sectors that might be in temporary or indeed permanent decline into sectors that we think will be much more successful into the 2020s.
Thanks, Tom. Michael, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, yes, absolutely. We need a jobs guarantee for young people. We need a jobs guarantee for those who are at risk of long-term unemployment. This would be a program of employers of the state would become the employer of last resort. This is proposals that have been, kind of bits of it have been adopted by many countries. But the fact is the state should take responsibility for ensuring that people can engage economically and therefore socially. It can be done through not say like Jobs Bridge, which actually was a subsidy to private sector employers and highly exploitative. It should be done through the public sector, local authorities, public agencies, but also through civil society groups, everything from the GAA to local community groups to drug awareness groups. There's just, there's a lot of work, social work that can be done out there that brings people back into activity, that actually stabilizes demand. And the cost would not be all that much more than, leaving them on long-term unemployment payments where they're making no contribution.
Yeah, it just sounds like a new way of thinking is needed. Okay, another question from Barry Murphy of OPATSI. Barry says, the issue of bogus self-employment is a huge issue for workers, but also on lost revenue to the state, with well over $1 billion having been lost over the last number of years in employer, PRSI, etc. What are the panelists' views on the failure of successive governments to tackle this issue, and why isn't the issue getting traction in the mainstream media? Who'd like to take that first?
Well, I'll just step in first. It has always perplexed me why the Department of Social Protection, especially since they are the ones that manage the Social Insurance Fund, has not taken this issue more seriously. We don't know the extent of bogus self-employment, but certainly during the recession period, there was all the indicators that it was very high. It probably kind of receded a bit, though it was still there. It was still a phenomenon during the recovery period. We're going to see it increase again. As there's a lot of slack in the economy. Employers are going to be finding it hard to employ full-time people. I think it's needed is two things. One, revenue commissioners and Department of Social Protection have to agree a common definition of what is employment and self-employment. They don't have that common definition. They have different definitions. And secondly, whether it's in the construction sector, and we shouldn't just think it's in construction. I say Barry's from OPATSI, but it's not just in construction. I mean, it's in a number. It's leaking out to a number of areas. The simple rule is this: it's a default rule that all employees are anybody hired by a firm is considered to be an employee unless the employer can show otherwise, according to the unified rules between Revenue and Department of Social Protection. In other words, the burden of proof must be put on the employers why they are trying to establish self-employment.
Tom, did you want to comment on that?
Just to say that I obviously agree with what Michael said there, and it obviously hasn't been a priority of government because it is something that could be resolved. Whether that reflects the composition of previous governments, I cannot say. But obviously it is a loss to the Exchequer, and a loss to the Exchequer that they're letting ride. It is a benefit only to the bad employers that are exploiting the situation. So I mean, it would be speculation on my part to go further than that. But from a fiscal point of view, it absolutely makes no sense to allow this to persist. There was a concern in the post 2008 crisis period around getting people back to work, and there was, in my view, an attitude that anything goes, anything that will work to get people back working should be allowable. So in many respects, standards in terms of quality of work were let slide. Some of that was ideological, but some of it was simply the fact that we had a very high unemployment rate, and that of course meant that the balance of power as well was very much in the favour of employers. And in a country like Ireland, where labour rights are very, very weak, lack of rights to collective bargaining and so on and so forth, it creates a kind of a perfect storm in favour of the employer. And if you don't have a government, and if you don't have a department that is willing to stand up for workers, then you get the situation that we have at the moment.
Great, thanks. We've two more questions. I think we've time for just two more. This one is, as some employments may not recover quickly or at all from the pandemic, what sort of time frame do the speakers envisage us reaching full employment? And what policies would be a priority to enable us to reach full employment in as short a time as possible?
Well, 2021 will still be a year with very high unemployment. The likelihood is that we will probably only dip below 10% unemployment around the summer of next year. And the reality is, until the population are confident that the virus has been de facto eliminated from the population, it's only at that point that we will really start to see a full recovery. Having said that, because of the very, very high level of savings in the economy, broadly incomes haven't collapsed as of yet, although the risk is certainly that business failures will accelerate as part of a cascade over the winter and spring, particularly if the more extreme levels of lockdown continue to be required. But in terms of recovery, in terms of getting back to where we were prior to the crisis, you're probably looking at the middle of this decade before you get down to around the 5% level. Having said that, it could be much quicker. It's an unprecedented crisis. There isn't really an obvious parallel to this one. It's very different from the supply side crises of the 70s. It's very different from the demand side crisis of 2008. It's an enforced supply side crisis, and we have put in place most of the measures that would preserve what was there beforehand. So there is the possibility of a very, very swift recovery, as we're seeing already in places like China and Taiwan. They have been able to bounce back very, very quickly once they've been able to eliminate the virus. So there is a possibility of a very quick return. What I would say in terms of those policies is that everything that we said earlier, the infrastructure package that's coming from Europe will be very, very important across Europe. Within Ireland itself, ensuring that we make those investments. As Michael said, investment is not a cost. Investment is what will lead to greater job growth into the future. All those type of things, those things will be very important. Dealing with the cost of living crisis, dealing with the housing crisis will help deal with the employment crisis. So we need more people going through apprenticeships, more people being trained up into construction that will allow them to build those houses, that will deal with that crisis, and that will get the employment rate back up again. All of this can be achieved, but we have to think about this as a 3 to 5 year project.
Michael, did you want to come in on that?
No, I think Tom kind of answered it all. Let's go to the next question.
Okay, I'll bring the next question directly to you, so Michael. This is about universal basic income. I think I've heard you speak about this before. What's your view between a universal basic income, a living wage, and a jobs guarantee? Although they are very different measures, which would be the best response to increasing employment?
Well, the best response for increasing employment would be a jobs guarantee, especially when you have a period where we could be looking into double-digit unemployment into next year and possibly even the following year, depending on how bad this second lockdown is going to be, and even if there's going to be another lockdown in the future. So if you want to get people back in employment, obviously it is virus dependent, but the state can take measures, especially in terms of a job guarantee that the state will step in and become the employer of last resort. A living wage is important to make sure that people who do get in jobs are not living in in-work poverty. I mean, the CSO published data on their survey of income and living conditions. Over 10% of people in work are officially classified as living in deprivation, which is just, you kind of think of deprivation as, among the unemployed, which of course is very high there. It's very high among those who are unable to work because of sickness and disability. But you don't think of it as people in work. And actually, even two-income families, 1 out of every 10 households of two-income families have those deprivations. So a living wage is important not only to help the households, but to drive the recovery. Basic income. There's a lot of good points about basic income, and I do believe the trade union movement should have a discussion and a debate about it. Just because you debate something doesn't necessarily mean you agree with the proposition. But there's a lot to learn from basic income, even if you don't support the idea. To my mind, at this stage, it's not. We can't afford it. We have other priorities. We have investment priorities, public service priorities. Universal basic services, as Tom mentioned, might be a better bet because that has the capacity to kind of glue society together, the relationships together at a much lower cost. But nonetheless, the idea of basic income whereby you create a floor for people is something that we're going to have to take seriously because we saw so many people in danger of falling through that floor. And that's why the government had to react with the pandemic unemployment payment, which in some sense you could say is a kind of, a guaranteed income. So let's have that debate and see what ideas come out of it.
Yeah, lots of interventions that were taken as post-pandemic kind of took a lot of us by surprise, really, and shows the capacity that is there. Rather than taking that question to you, Tom, if you don't mind, I'm going to put the very last question to you in the interest of time. The last question is about housing. Is there any research, national or international, on the cost effectiveness of state-led house building programs? Gosh, we're covering everything tonight.
Well, a number of countries or cities in many cases have very, very successfully engaged in public house building. I mean, Vienna, I suppose, is the most obvious example with their cost rental model. There is no reason to suppose that the state cannot efficiently and successfully engage in a multi-billion scale program of house building on an annual basis. My view is that what should be done is that a semi-state should be established, which will essentially fund it. Obviously, then give out the contracts probably to private builders to actually build the houses, but the state would own them and in many cases rent them out. So there's no economic reason why that could not work. And it's worth noting that the state can borrow at cheaper rates than the private sector. That's always the case. The private sector always has a margin over the state. And Michael made the point of hyper low interest rates, absolutely important to bed them in. or bake them in, as he said, for 20, 30, even 100 years at very, very low rates. And then you're not looking to make a profit here. You just want to make enough money that you can reinvest. So that also reduces the cost. You can build on state land in many cases. So absolutely no reason why the state can't do that.
Brilliant.
If I could just say, I think the questioner is right to suggest that should we look into international experiences and that, but we really don't have to look too far. The Department of Finance actually published a paper 2 years ago, and they said that it was far more expensive for the state to rent housing from the private sector through things like the rental accommodation scheme or the housing assistance payment. Instead, it'd be far cheaper to build houses itself. So we have our own Department of Finance, which, by the way, is not noted for being a spendthrift, let's all get all, let's provide everybody with public goods kind of department. So,
Yeah, well, by spending on HAP instead of spending on building houses, we're ultimately committing to provide perpetual subsidies to landlords.
And it certainly would be better value than people in emergency accommodation up and down the country going to private owners and hotels. Wonderful. Thank you both very much for your responses to those questions. They were really good questions. We're going to have to wrap it up now, but just to finish off, I just want to thank very much both Michael and Tom, and thank SIPTU and the Nevin Institute for their participation and involvement in this. And I would direct participants to those documents that we referenced earlier on, and we'll try and share them with you. The next webinar we have is on the 25th of November, and that's being hosted by Wexford. And the topic is around development and decency. And there's another one then in December on apprenticeships, and I gather that's hosted by Cork again. So the local trades council is still working, obviously, in your community to protect workers. So we'd encourage everyone to get in touch with them and support them on social media. Follow the One Movement, One Cork, One Galway, on Facebook and Twitter. There's new events and materials coming online and being developed all the time, so keep an eye out for those. Encourage your family and friends and colleagues to join a union, because as we've seen during this pandemic, unions are the only people speaking up for workers, whether it's about safety, access to PPE, and making sure payments get to workers, and that workers get the wages in the best conditions possible during this time. So stay in touch. This is it's also important that people stay in touch with their unions, especially while many of us working remotely. Unions are still working on your behalf and would like to hear from you, and perhaps let us know what events you'd be interested in us having, and what you'd like to talk about and what materials you'd like to produce. So finally, I just want to thank our wonderful panelists, Tom and Michael, once again for their contributions, which certainly gives us plenty of food for thought. And thank you to everyone who participated. A special word of thanks and acknowledgement to Hazel Gavigan from Forsa, who has been our technical support in the background for tonight. So thank you all very much for your attention. Hope you stay safe, stay home. And if you're not at home and if you're out and about, wash your hands and keep your distance and keep your mask on. So until the next time, thank you very much and good evening.
Bye.